Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going to be taking our second look at Frankie, Valli and the Four Seasons, and this is to follow on from the video I did a couple of weeks ago now, I think, where I analysed Frankie's voice and his head voice and pointing out whether it was falsetto or not. We're going to do that in this video again because in the comment section the song Sherry came up and was suggested, and it was something that some people struggled to hear, whether it was head voice or falsetto, so we'll get into that. Also, this is going to be the first video I've ever done listening to the original audio, the record as it was released back in the day. I'm going to leave you guys a link in the description below and pinned to the top of the comments so you guys can go and watch the exact video that I am going to watch and listen to. And I'm not going to be doing it on this video because it's the exact audio. It's definitely going to be blocked on copyrights. So you can go and listen to that, get yourself in the mood for the analysis video that's going to follow. I am going to take tiny sections of this song to analyze so that we can hear Frankie's voice and what he's doing, but hopefully it won't be enough to then get the copyright block. So click on that link, listen to this classic track, and then come back to this analysis video. So just the 2 to 2.5 minute song length that was the standard thing at the time for the Four Seasons, but there's so much crammed in there. I want you guys to listen out for at about 16 or 17 seconds where we have Frankie singing in his chest voice, and we get such a great example of the sound between his chest voice and his head voice in such a short vocal phrase. So I'm just going to play through the notes of the melody that Frankie is singing. We're starting straight off the bat with a G4. We then go to a C5. Again, this is right up there in the male tenor range, up to an E5, down to a D5, down to a C5 again, then a B4, A4, B4, back down to G4. Now the interesting thing here, when I play through those notes, you'll see that I started where I ended, so that is the same note. But when you listen to it, you'll hear that Frankie's voice sounds totally different, even though we're hearing the same note. So we're listening out for the share of Sherry, and at the end of this vocal phrase, the B of baby. So hopefully you could hear the difference between the tone that's being produced, and the reason for that is because Frankie sings that first vocal phrase in chest voice, and in order to hit those heights, the E5 that I just demonstrated, he's thinning out his voice, getting right up there in his head voice and getting such a clean sound with his vocal, but it's all in one vocal phrase, all with one breath, once he starts up in that head voice, so he has to bring the head voice down to where he started again. The reason it's going to sound more nasal, singing a lower note in that pure, clean head voice sound, is because as you ascend, you thin out the voice, because that's how you get up to higher notes, and it's going to naturally resonate in the head more, and a lot of singers try and push that sound forwards into their nasal area and between the eyes in order to get that resonance to happen at the front. And it's something that you'll experience when you sing quite a lot, the resonance moving up through your head as you ascend. And that is what's happening with the resonance of the voice. It doesn't have that that body to it in chest voice. It's all happening up here. So there's a definite tonal shift, and the reason for that is because the voice has already been thinned out to get to the E5, and then coming back down again, it's the same sound, the same tone that's being used all the way down to the G4 where we started. Another thing that could happen as Frankie makes his way down from E5 to A4, he could bring in more of that chest voice sound, but he's going back up to B4. So it means that he might start pulling up his chest voice and straining, and he might not even make it to that B4. So it's a lot better to keep that lighter head voice quality to the sound all the way down to A4 and keep that sound going so that he can get back up to B4 and then go back down to G and keep that all in that head voice coordination, rather than going down to A4 and getting that heavier coordination of chest voice, because pulling up chest voice is something that you will be able to distinguish straight away as a sound, because people start to strain and struggle to hit notes because the sound is too full to take really high up in your range. You have to thin that out. So it means that Frankie is keeping a thin sound all the way down to A4, keeping that thin sound up to B4 and the same sound down to G4, so we can keep it one long consistent sound. But you can head over to that first video that I did on Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons if you want to check out a little bit more analysis of Frankie's voice. I'm not going to get into the same details that I did there. This just happened to be a great song and it popped up in the comments. So I'm just going to get into a bit of the background that I failed to get into on that first video. And I mentioned in that video about these guys surviving that British invasion and still being popular, even though so many bands fell by the wayside because of all of those bands coming over from the UK and dominating the charts. They can be traced back as early as 1953 when they started, and throughout the 50s really trying to make a go of it, but unfortunately the releases that they had didn't do particularly well. And in 1960 they went to an audition to play at a bowling alley, but unfortunately they didn't get that gig, and the bowling alley was called the Four Seasons because they weren't known by that until 1960, because they thought that they'd failed the audition, but at least they left with a band name, so they were called the Four Seasons from then on. The guys had done some session work with Bob Crew, who was a producer and songwriter at the time, and Bob had a production company with which he signed the Four Seasons to, and unfortunately their first song didn't chart, but they had this song that Bob Gaudio had written before rehearsal called Sherry, the one that we've just been listening to, and they knew that this was a good song. They wanted to find a company to help them distribute it. So Frankie Valli spoke to Randy Wood, and Randy was the sales manager at VJ Records at the time. Randy really loved the song, and they signed a recording contract with VJ Records. They became the first white artists to ever have signed to VJ Records. They recorded their album with Sherry on there, and the album was actually called Sherry and 11 Others. They released Sherry as a single, and it was a monster hit, and it went to #1, obviously their first #1, and this is in 1962. Just to mention as well that they were still signed with Bob Crew's production company. Bob managed to work out something with the record label where everybody was happy. So the ball was now well and truly rolling, because they followed up Sherry with Big Girls Don't Cry, Walk Like a Man, Candy Girl, Ain't That a Shame. So many massive hits. At one point they had 3 consecutive #1s in the chart. Things took a bit of a turn for the worse with VJ Records, because they took on the responsibility to distribute the Beatles albums, and the Beatles became quite popular. They could not keep up with the demand, and obviously people started complaining, wanting to get their hands on the Beatles albums. At this same time, the Four Seasons were in a royalty dispute with the record label, because the albums that they'd released with VJ Records, they hadn't received any royalties. So out of the dispute came the decision that the Four Seasons had to record one more album for the record label. So VJ Records retained the rights to the Four Seasons songs and just started releasing them as quickly as possible in order to try and make up for the money they were losing, not being able to distribute the Beatles albums, all of the complaints that were coming in. It just so happened that in 1966, VJ Records went bankrupt, and the Four Seasons were then given the rights to their music that they'd recorded with the record label, so the only compensation they received was getting the rights to their music back again once the record label went bust. But they should have had those rights anyway, but that's just how the music industry works. So after this, they then moved to Philips Records, and at the end of the 60s, they experienced a bit of a decline in popularity, but by the early 70s, they signed with Motown Records, and in 1972 is when they released Chameleon. They also recorded another album with Motown Records, but that wasn't released. Having just parted ways with Motown Records and recorded an album that wasn't going to be released, Frankie got in touch with the record label and offered to pay them for the songs so that he could release them. But once he found out how much the record label wanted for those songs, he couldn't afford them. He decided he could just get one. So he paid $4,000 for My Eyes Adored You. And he released this in 1974, and it went to #1. It was a massive hit. And in 1975, both he and the Four Seasons independently were charting. And it just so happens that Motown then started releasing songs typically, and one of those was called The Night, which was a massive hit here in the UK, got to #7. In 1975, they released Who Loves You, and that was a massive selling album. It sold over 1 million copies and was a huge hit here in the UK as well. In 1976, they released December 1963, Oh What a Night, and you don't need me to tell you, but that was a massive hit. It got to #1 in the USA and the UK. They were a hugely popular live act in the 70s, and in 1978 is when Frankie sang the Grease theme for the movie of the same name, and I mentioned that in the other video about Barry Gibb being a massive fan of Frankie's and vice versa, so they teamed up on that, and it was great for Frankie to sing that song and be on that soundtrack and sing the theme tune to the highest grossing musical in history at that point. So definitely a good career move by Frankie, and like Frankie says, maybe Barry would have thought it through and sung it himself if he'd realised how big the movie was going to be and how big that song was going to be. As I mentioned in the other video, we have the massively popular Jersey Boys West End show here in London, so the songs are still connecting with an audience en masse night after night. But it's great to have a look back at Frankie's vocal in this song and hear the difference between those vocal registers. Thank you guys for suggesting this song to take a listen to, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!